For 2024, GOP&G, we will have a 27,377 million kina budget, a record budget. Going from top down, let's have a look at the main headline numbers. Revenue projected for next year, a whopping 23,394 million kina. That's up. If you look at the two columns on your left, we've got on the far left column our original budget revenue number of 19,582 million, and then as we brought in our supplementary budget in September, October, we amended that to 20,404. So taking the difference, I'm comparing here changes to the supplementary budget, from 2024, and I'll go through that throughout this explanation, and I think later on Secretary, hopefully he can talk to you about changes of the 2024 budget with the original for those that are interested. So on revenue, we've got an increase of 14.7%, or nominally 2,990 million kina increase. So is this a realistic number? Many of us will be asking. So hopefully we'll see what the responses are tomorrow. And our brother Paul B, hopefully he can be a little bit kind on this particular number. So is it a large number or a small number? Is it realistic or unrealistic? I guess based on historical records, you may say that it's high in terms of a long-term history since we collected data at independence, 1975. But don't forget, we delivered a 12.7% increase in 2021, and we all know the significance of that year, and then a 35.9% increase in 2022. And for this year, we're looking at over 10.1%. We have, since forming this government, in the last 4 budgets that we have delivered, we've met our revenue estimates entirely. So we've got a good record of delivering on our forecasts or delivering on our revenue estimates. If we have a look at the breakup of our revenue, as you all know, comprises 3 major components. On tax revenue, 18.6 or 18,695 million. Non-tax is 2,494, and our grants are 2,205. I know it's difficult for most of you at the back. Please bear with me. I'll try to slow down on the numbers. So looking at the breakup, we'll just look at some of the main components here. On tax revenue, we've got that projected at, again, repeat, 18,695 million of that 23,394, or a 14.5% increase. How did we get to that figure? We've assumed a 10% nominal growth in GDP, and the drivers for that, Secretary will go into it in far more detail, and so will I with my presentation to the floor later this evening. But the main drivers here, 3% new measures. We have tobacco, and a proposed fishing license. With tobacco, we're proposing a 20% increase in excise on our tier 2 cigarette lines, and for our fishing license, that's proposed to come in effective 1st of July, subject to full and hopefully inclusive consultation, and that particular fee, I won't give you an estimate today, but it's going to be, the calculation will be something like a 10 to 20% export tax on the unprocessed fish based on its FOB value. So the breakup of our 14.5%, yep, again, that's based on 10% nominal GDP growth, including our drivers that I've just mentioned contributing about 3%, and of course a 1.5% compliance gain. I'm not going to go in detail with all of the others, but I'll just focus a little bit on revenue, given that it's quite high for next year, and to try and justify some of our numbers. Looking at our non-tax revenue, that's growing at a whopping 21.2%, so increasing to 2,494 million, up from 2,058 million in our supplementary, a nominal increase of 436%. So what's driving that non-tax increase? That particular line, if you recall, we had the PMMR, which was the legislation to sweep accounts in our state-owned agencies. It was determined as unconstitutional, so there was about a 2-year lag. We then replaced that with the NTRA, the Non-Tax Revenue Act. So that's now effective, and became effective in I think about the third quarter of this year. So we haven't had long to try and sweep funds from those remaining accounts, but just broadly, from the last brief, if I recall correctly, we had about 845 million in our trust accounts, and the challenge now is to collect all of those this year and remit it to WPA, and of course minus a little bit back for those agencies to keep them going till the end of the year. But the legislation is very clear. I don't have any powers to amend that particular act, and the legislation is very clear. We need to sweep 100% of funds inside there. So the key drivers for the 21.2% increase, we're expecting around about 1,280 million kina in collections from those state agencies I mentioned, NFA, immigration, and so forth. And the new one for 2024, where we're expecting about a 200 million collection, will be from the National Gaming Control Board. And I'll stop commenting on that for fear of being accused of being conflicted. Okay, so moving down to grants, that's an increase of 8.9%. That reflects the strong international support that we've received in the last 4 years, and I wanted to, on behalf of especially my colleague, the Minister for National Planning, thank our international partners for the support they've given us, not just in budget support, but TA, technical assistance as well, and we hope to continue our strong and very sincere working relationship with them. Okay, that's about it from revenue, and I've got another 20 minutes, so I'll follow my time here. On expenditure, or our budget, projecting 27,377 million kina for 2024. That's up on our 2023 budget projection of 24,567 million, or as I'm comparing this morning, to our supplementary budget of 25,338. So that's an 8% increase, or nominally 2,039. So 8% increase. What's driving that? Well, we expect that number with our fiscal consolidation strategy, and the breakup of that 8%. Broadly, we're allowing 5% for inflation and population growth at 3%. Okay, just looking and having a brief look at the breakup of our expenditure. Our operating budget increases by 7% from 11.3 billion to 12 billion for next year, an increase of 791 million kina. Looking down, moving through quickly on the next line down, compensation of employees or wages for the public sector. Now, many people always confuse this number. It's now sitting at 7 billion or 7,034 million. And in case you're sitting there and saying, wow, that's a really big wage bill for public servants in Waigani. No, that number also includes the wages for our teachers, wages for our policemen and women, and wages for our doctors and nurses. So not just those based in Waigani. Moving down, goods and services, that's increasing by 16%, projected at 5,057 million for 2024, up from the 4,358 in the supplementary budget. And whilst that 16% or 699 million kina appears to be high, let's not forget the way in which we complete our accounts. That number also includes things like government arrears, a budget of 300 million, compensation of employee arrears. This year will be around about 120 million, and a host of other things which are kind of related to government and PIP work as well. Provincial transfers, moving through, that's funds that we remit to our 22 provincial governments. So that's up next year to 1,536 million, up from 1,458 million, a 5.3% increase, or 78 million kina. That's to comply with legal requirements. Moving down to our debt increase, our debt interest increase. Our debt component projected for next year increases to 3,051 billion, up from 2,511 in our 2023 forecast, and up from 2,784 million kina in our supplementary budget. That's a 9.6% increase, or 267 million kina increase in our debt interest component. And of course that reflects the general increase in global interest rates, though I know some areas are coming down. But interesting to note, that's still a 1 billion kina savings from our lower average interest costs of our debt since we took over in 2018. So what are we measuring that against? And I repeat, despite increasing our debt interest by 9.6%, or 267 million kina, we're still saving around about 1 billion kina a year. From what, you might ask? Well, firstly, on our debt profile, we have our external financing and our domestic. They're broken up about half each. On our external borrowings, since we came in, you're all familiar with our story. We converted from expensive commercial loans to good, cheap external financing, dropping interest rates from on average on our commercial loans before we took office, which were around about 8% plus, down to now on average a little below 5%. The first 2.5 years, in fact, first 2.5, nearly 3 years, we were tracking below 2%. But then interest rates globally took a peak, and so that's increased our cost to today. But externally, we've dropped the cost of debt from 8 to below 5%. Domestically, with the way in which we've conducted more efficient auctions, we've reduced, as most of you would be aware, on our government inscribed stock or treasury bonds, on our 10-year paper, we've dropped it from around 10, 11% to now around about 6%, and with our treasury bills, we've dropped that from 7.5% to now around about 3%. So together, the lower costs in our external borrowings and our domestic still means that despite this particular increase in our interest cost, we're still saving about 1 billion kina with our policies on debt control. Okay, so just moving down on the all-important capital budget, I'll just go through the mainframe numbers and I'll leave my colleague, Minister for National Planning, Minister Hon, to go through the details. But for next year, we will be projecting another record, 10,700 million or 10.7 billion kina for our capital budget. Now that's up from our 2023 budget and the supplementary, up from our projected 9,796 million kina. That's a 9.2% increase, or nearly a billion kina increase on our capital budget. That of course reflects the government's strong growth agenda. Our capital budget, as you're aware, is made up of 3 components. Our government PIP, Public Investment Program, that's 7,281 million, a 10% increase. We fund that through government revenues, don't forget. We have our endorsed loans book of 1,214 million, a 5% increase, and of course our grant sitting at 2.2 billion or 2,205 million kina. So all of those numbers reflect once again our very, very strong government growth agenda. So looking at our debt position, an interesting point. We don't have all of our numbers up there, and I would have wanted to go through in a little bit of detail with you today. Our debt to GDP peaks this year in our 2023 budget. It peaks this year, and then next year it will reduce until we reach our target date of 2034 to give the government of the day the option of a sovereign-free loan. Our debt position, I'd like to comment on that a little bit more this morning. I hope these numbers are updated. I think they are. Our debt position projected for next year, and I'll comment a little bit more about this because I note that out in the community, especially on social media, not that I follow it, there's a lot of concern, but a lot of it very, very misplaced concerns, and based, with all due respects, on ignorance. So if I can just share with you some other numbers. On debt projected for next year, it will be projected at 60 62,599 million kina. It will increase for the next year after that in 2025 to 65.2 billion kina, and it peaks in 2026 at 66,000 or 66.5 billion kina. And then from 2027 to 2034, over the next 7 years, starting with a target date of 2027, we will then switch from deficit-driven budgets to surplus-driven budgets, and we hope and we're targeting an option for the government in 2034 to have a debt-free budget. Of course, as most of you are aware, that is not practical, and that I would be very surprised if that would be the advice from our international multilateral partners. At this point in time, in terms of planning, I've been sharing with both Prime Minister Marape and our colleagues in both the Cabinet and Government Caucus. We need to, as a government, as a country, start looking at what debt to GDP level is practical for our country, and of course to balance growth with the management of debt. Yeah, personally, I'm happy to share with you today, I would prefer the number to be around about the 10% mark, which would put us in the top 1/4 of countries globally. That's a very ambitious target, I know, but you know, I'm allowing in there some stuff-ups, some ambitious politicians taking over, and it increases to 20% debt to GDP. You know, that's still very, very workable and a comfortable, manageable rate for our country. So I just want to make those points there on debt. So whilst the debt is high, we continue to control debt. Our deficit targets, because of fiscal consolidation, reducing our deficit as a share of our GDP continues to reduce. And on fiscal consolidation, if you look at our record over the last 4 years, we've reduced our deficit as a share of GDP very, very aggressively. Yeah, we've been reducing that at about 1% of GDP, or about 1 billion kina per annum. That's very aggressive, and if you compare Papua New Guinea to, say, our neighbour Australia, where we measure a lot of our performances, including rugby, unfortunately, we're reducing our deficit as a share of GDP even more aggressively than the Australian government. And I shared my numbers with my counterpart, Treasurer Hon. And another important note, if you look and compare apples with apples, the formula with which we calculate our debt to GDP numbers, currently, or at least next year, our projected figure next year of 51.4%, I dare say, is now less than Australia's. If you look at the Australian budget, they don't take into account state government debts, but if you add it together like we do in PNG to compare apples and apples, little brother is learning a few tricks and performing quite well, relatively speaking. Okay, thank you. That's all I'll comment now on our government framework, and if I can just now go through very quickly some parts of our remaining presentation, and I've got about 6 minutes to do that, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, the Minister for National Planning. So if we can move to the second page. Thank you. Someone's awake. On economic growth, a metric which Prime Minister Marape, myself and other economic ministers tend to discuss a lot these days, is the size of our economy, or the size of our GDP. We're expecting that to grow from 111 billion kina this year. That was revised down from 113, if you recall, in my last year's presentation, to 122 billion kina in 2024. The takeaway from these numbers, this is over 50% higher than the 79 billion kina we inherited in 2019. So if we're using non-resource growth, which is the best measure for measuring living standards, growth will continue at its high levels of 5.2%. That was back in 2022, 4.5% this year, and 4.7% next year. So as a target date, it's a nice topic to talk about. Yeah, we do have dreams as well. In addition to the projected 122 billion kina economy for next year, based on our 13-year plan, which for those of you that have had a look at it, it is very, very conservative and does not, in its assumptions, cost in revenues from our resource projects, except Porgera, and even then we've sort of got it wrong, but we'll get it right. So we don't cost in Papua LNG, Pinyang, Papua Gold Pool, Wildebeest and all those other exciting projects. We're expecting our economy to reach 200 billion by 2030, and then 5 years after that, in 2035, a 300 billion kina economy. These are numbers that you should be very happy that I'm circulating around with our politicians. It's nice to have targets, meaningful and realistic targets. And here's another one that I'll introduce for today. By 2048, we're projecting a 1 trillion kina economy. Now that's a number you've never heard of before. 2048, I think I'll be 89 years young by then. So thank you. That's just a quick discussion on economic growth. On debt and deficit, I've covered that in a fair bit of detail. So if you have a look at that, those are the numbers which I covered with you earlier. Yeah, and the main line to look at, well, they're all important 5 lines, but starting from 2024, yeah, our deficit is dropping down from 4.9 billion for this year projected, down to about 3.9. And that gives us the difference between that, our 1 billion kina decrease. Next year, projecting it to go down to negative 2,654 or 2,654 million kina for our deficit, and have a look at that. It turns into a surplus in 2027. We're on target we're on track to meet that target. That'll be our first budget surplus since 2010. And from there, you'll see surplus budgets. When you add that to our capital budget, by 2032, the government of the day, at the end of the 12th Parliament, will have around about 52 billion kina to pump into our economy. So let's make sure that on the micro level, we have clearly costed realistic sectoral plans, and that our ministers do have the tools to implement. So that's the takeaway from there. Debt numbers, which I've read out, are there on the second last line, in millions of kina. And as I mentioned, debt peaks this year when you use debt to GDP measure at 52.6%, dropping down next year to 51.1 and moving down until 2034. Okay, 2034. So an interesting point here, that we're talking about planning topics, planning discussions. By 2031, if we're keeping debt to GDP at 20%, that's where we might round off some of our key numbers on debt for 2032. So thank you. Just looking very quickly on the economic sector, if we could. I'm sorry, that photo up there was our visit to the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank in Beijing. We're nearly there. To sign up as a member of that particular bank. Just a little bit of paperwork, which I'm waiting for my good friend, the Secretary for Foreign Affairs, to conclude, and then we can start interacting more with them. So in addition to the IMF, World Bank and ADB, they will be a welcome addition as a multilateral partner. The economic sector, I won't go through all of the sectors this morning, but just on the economic one, we'll be receiving a very significant 45.9% increase in funding. And again, I'll leave all of the details to Secretary for Treasury. We have a total budget of about 1,608 million, which is about $500 million more than in this year's budget. So inside that increase, again, I'll leave it to my departmental head to provide you the details, but suffice to say there are very major increases for our key agriculture sector agencies, as well as for forest. That's another topic. And the tourism sectors and support for our special economic zones. Yes, I know it's created some concerns amongst us here. The government is focusing very much on special economic zones. The question remains, are they feasible? Are they viable for our country? In that respect, I've been urging my colleague, the Minister for International Trade and Investment, if he could quickly and promptly complete whatever briefs that he has embarked on to the Department of Treasury, so that we can go through in detail whatever numbers that they have, and hopefully be in a position to support this very important initiative, despite further verification and justification needed. Okay, I've now reached my time, so I won't cover all of my presentation here, but an important point, when we're talking about utilities of power and water and sanitation, on top of the increase of 45.9% for the economic sector, our budget for next year has increased funding for the utilities of water, power, by a very large 58.9% compared to this year's budget. So that's a total of 1,200 million kina, 1.2 million kina for this particular sector. Moving on very quickly to page 7, if we may. To page 7. That's a photo there of Prime Minister Marape and myself meeting our colleague, the US Secretary of Treasury, and it's really important that I share with you today. We've been stepping up our relationship with the US government to try and increase the relationship with US Treasury as we have with our Australian Treasury counterparts. at all times during our budgeting, completing our 5-year fiscal frameworks, including our 13-year plan. We work very closely with the IMF, who have ticked off, who have endorsed all of the numbers which I share with you today. But unlike our relationship with the Australian Treasury, who sign off as well, our frameworks, we're wanting the US Treasury to do that. And that was one of the main agenda items that we had raised with Secretary Yellen. On the capital budget, I won't touch it anymore. I've covered the main points there. Moving on very quickly, PNG Connect program remains our flagship policy agenda to get growth going again. This year we've increased our funding to 905 million kina for missing link roads, and we've also put in for the first time 100 million kina in arrears. So that particular sector and ministry receives over 1 billion kina, to the envy of his colleagues in cabinet. A really nice story that has come out of our PNG Connect program has been the new road to telephony. And I was hoping those pictures would start moving. So who can forget those really touching WhatsApp images as the road to telephone was opened for the very first time just last month. And with that, I'm hoping the images start moving. Hint, hint. And I was about to say the look for joy and excitement as people were finally connected, which we can see when the images start moving. Well, we got that right. It's now starting to move, but someone forgot the volume. You know, that was really the big part of this. We discussed this for a whole week, remember? And I said, don't stuff up. Make sure we've got the volume. Thanks for listening. Anyway, to conclude, this is the human face of some of our major budget allocations. And so with that winding down, I couldn't have a presentation without talking about health and education, or our essential services. We've increased funding for health and education from 6,158 million this year to 6,670 million kina next year, an increase of over 500 million kina, or 8.3%. And as I mentioned earlier, when we talked about our 7 billion kina personal emoluments budget, funding will support not just our bureaucrats in Waigani, in Lae and other centres, but will also support another 3,400 teachers that we have in country, which is a 5% increase for next year. So that's an increase of 68,110 teachers to 82,790 by 2027. So a 5% increase for the total number of teachers for the next 5 years, and then in our 13-year plan after that, 2028 onwards, it increases to 10%. Hopefully meeting our HDI targets, our SDG targets that we have set for ourselves. This funding will also support another 840 health workers, and again a 5% increase. That's what we've pumped in on our assumption for the increase in staffing. So education and health, 5% increase in the next 5 years, and then amended to 10%. We don't have it in here, but for police, we're increasing police personnel by 500 500 police personnel annually, and if you work backwards, that's roughly around about a 10% increase. And then at 2027, we'll continue with our core services, or our essential services, teachers, doctors, health workers, and police, increasing at 10%. Another important point here, funding for our all-important government tuition fee subsidy scheme increases from 764 million to 851 million. Inside that particular budget of 851 million kina, most of you may not be aware, there is a 20% project fee component calculated on the fee that applies at elementary level all the way up to high school. Parents are expected to pay that amount as part of our household assistance package. We've taken on board that particular responsibility, so it's free for our parents. Law and order issues are becoming a growing problem. I know some of you might look at me in horror and say, is becoming? Where have you been? I'll leave it as that because of time. And then winding down, our household assistance package continues and increases to 1,617 million kina over the next 3 years. With our interventions in trying to fix the foreign exchange problem and trying to achieve kina convertibility. Kina convertibility, what do we mean? The ability of our citizens in our country to change kina for any currency in the world at any amount. That's a really nice target to have. But as part of our targeted program supported by the IMF, we have entered into a sequence roadmap for kina convertibility, and that includes some changes. I'll be careful how I word this. Some changes to the value of the kina, depreciating in the short term as we try to find the real value of the kina pegged to the US dollar. And that's a whole discussion in itself, which I will have for another time. But the value of the kina to the US, interestingly, when we came into office 4 years ago, the IMF were telling us their computation. The kina was overvalued by about 16% 4 years ago. That dropped down to about 13, 11, and just a few days ago, as I was preparing for this presentation and putting together our budget speech, I'm advised that it's sitting around about 7 to 8%. So, you know, the whole idea is to bring the kina back down to that particular value. All of you have seen a drop of about, I think, 5.5% kina to the US dollar. Some of you have read some of the projections by our commercial banks. They're very, very similar to some of the numbers that we're getting. But I'll leave it at that for the time being. I'll touch more on foreign exchange shortages and some of the plans we have in government at another sitting, because time doesn't really allow me. I'll wind down here and I'll move to the second last page. The second last page, I had to include this one in today's presentation. Yeah, just to clarify the position of the government and the opposition. They call for a devaluation of 20%, which is nowhere near the government's policy position. So in concluding, we're hoping to secure our future by the largest 27 billion kina budget in our history. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation this morning. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward with the Department of Treasury to continue interacting with you for the remainder of this year and into next year. So with that, I'll pass it back to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.